Magandang araw! I hope everyone who is watching this video is safe, healthy, and happy. So in this video, we will discuss how to prove validity of an argument by proof of invalidity. So in this presentation, we aim to review truth values of compound statements, describe how proof of invalidity is constructed, and finally, determine validity of arguments using the proof of invalidity. So let's have first a review of the rules on logical connective. So we have on the screen a truth table of the variables P and Q and constructing all possible truth value combinations. So we have for disjunction. So again, what's the rule? I-review lang natin. For disjunction, if one of the disjuncts is true, the disjunction is true. So pag may true, either si P or Q, yung disjunction nila, true na. For conjunction, P and Q, if one of the conjuncts is false, the conjunction is false. This time, pag false, either si P or Q, yung conjunction nila, false. For conditional P implies Q, this will only be false if P is true but Q is false. All other combinations would give us a true truth value. For the biconditional P, if and only if Q, if P and Q have the same truth values, then the biconditional will be true. Kung parehong true si P and Q, therefore P if and only if Q is also true. Kung pareho silang false, true pa din yung biconditional. Now, how does a proof of invalidity constructed? Okay, so it is done through assignment of truth value. So, we need to assign a false value to the conclusion, and if the premises turn out to be all true, then the argument is invalid. Okay? So, ibig sabihin, ang una nating gagawin ay mag-assign ng false truth value sa ating conclusion. And from that, we work our way out until we find out the truth value of the premises. If we find the truth values to be all true and our conclusion false as we have assigned earlier, then that particular argument is invalid. Okay, so we have an example here. So we have C implies M, R implies C. So those two are our premises. And a conclusion, R implies M. Okay, so the first step is to assign a false truth value to our conclusion, R implies M. When R implies M is false, it only means that R, which is our antecedent or premise, is true, and the conclusion or the consequent M is false. So, yun lang ang ibig sabihin nun. Yung R natin ay true at yung M natin ay false. Now, if that is the case, what are now the values of the two premises? So, initially, it is safe to surmise that we need to assume values for C, and explore the values of the premise from that. Okay, suppose we assign C as true. Okay, so una muna na possibility kung ang C natin ay true. Again, our R is true and M is false. Okay? When we assign C to be true, so we will now have true implies false because our M is false. And therefore, true implies false is false. And we find our first premise to be false. Okay? So, therefore, we have found a premise which is false, no, when C is true, and that renders our argument to be valid. Okay? So, kung true si C, valid yung ating argument. Tapos na ba yun? Hindi pa. Kasi hindi naman tayong sigurado. Hindi tayo sigurado na true si C. So, explore natin yung truth values kung siya ay false. Alright? Suppose this time C is false. So this is false. False implies false is true. So the first premise now is true. But remember, R is true and C is false. So true implies false is false. So the second premise now is false. So even if the first premise is true, we're able to find a premise, the second premise, in fact, to be false. And therefore, the argument is valid. So we were able to explore, no, the possibilities when C is true, when C is false, and in both cases, we are able to find a false premise. And therefore, we say that the argument is valid. Why? Bakit nga ulit? Because we have shown the existence of a false premise and all possible truth values, and we have shown that the argument is valid. So, ang gusto lang naman natin, dahil inassign na natin na false si conclusion, makakita tayo na kahit isang premise na false din para siya maging valid. Kung hindi natin magagawa yon, puro true yung premises, samantalang yung conclusion natin ay false, magiging invalid yung ating argument. So let's have another example. So we have B implies H and S, not H or S implies not B as our premises, and then B implies not B as our conclusion. So again, the first step is to assign a false truth value to our conclusion. So we assign B implies not B to be false. If that is the case, it only means B is true and of course not B is false. Okay? So alam na natin na true si B at si not B ay false. What about the other variables H and S? Okay? So we need to assume truth values for H and S and work our way out to be able to determine the truth values of the first and second premises. So first scenario, when both H and S are true. Remember, our B is true, not B is false. Let us say both H and S are true. So H and S are both true. Therefore, this conjunction is true, and true implies true is true. So the first premise is true. Since H is true, not H is false. But S is also true. Therefore, this disjunction is true. Our not B is false. Therefore, we have true implies false. And therefore, the second premise has a false truth value. Therefore, we are able to find a false premise. Therefore, argument appears to be valid. Tapos na ba? Siyempre, hindi pa. Kasi unang possibility pa lang yun kung pareho silang true. Paano naman kung pareho silang false? If H and S are both false, again, considering B is true and not B is false. H and S are both false, therefore, this conjunction will be false. True implies false is false. Therefore, we have found a premise which is false, rendering our argument valid. But for the sake of discussion, let us try to find out the value of the second premise. Remember, H and S are both false. Therefore, not H is true. Therefore, this junction is true and not B is false. So, true implies false is also false. So, in fact, the two premises have false truth value. Again, argument appears to be valid. Tapos na ba? Hindi pa din. Kasi pwedeng isa sa kanila true. So, what if H is true but S is false? So, H is true, S is false, therefore this conjunction is also false. So, B is true, true implies false is false. And therefore, we are able to find a premise which is false, making our argument appear to be valid. But again, for the sake of discussion, let's discuss the truth value for the second premise. H is true, S is false. H is true, therefore not H is false. False or false is false, not B is false. So false implies false is true. So the second premise is true, but then again, the first premise is false. That makes our argument appear to be valid. What about if H is false, but S is true this time? So H is false, S is true. Therefore, this conjunction is also false. So we have true implies false, false. So the first premise is false. So H is false, therefore not H is true. So we have true or true is true and not B is false. So true implies false is also false. So when H is false, S is true, and B is true, the two premises have false truth values. Again, the argument is valid. Now, since we have shown the existence of at least one false premise and all possible truth values, we have shown that the argument, the given argument, is valid. Then we have the third example. So we have not G or E implies M and T, not G and not E as the two premises, and therefore we have M and T. So M and T is the conclusion. Again, so the first step is to assign a false truth value for the conclusion, M and T. If M and T is false, this statement is false, anong ibig sabihin, no? Pwedeng pareho silang false, pwedeng isa sa kanila false, pero hindi pwedeng sila pareho true, no? Okay? Pwedeng isa sa kanila false, pwede ring parehong false, pero never na pareho silang true. So, yun dapat malinaw sa atin, no? By the rule of conjunction. Okay. When M and T are both false, okay, and we assume that G and E are both true, no? So, meron tayong dalawang variables na i-assume ng truth values, yung G and E. So, apat din yung possibilities. Pareho silang true, pareho silang false, yung isa sa kanila true, kunwari G yung true, tapos mamaya false si G. So, apat din yung explore natin. So, suppose M and T are false, no? And suppose G and E are both true. G and E are both true. So this disjunction is true. But we want the negation. So false implies false is true. So the first premise is true. What about the second premise? G and E are both true. Therefore, not G is false, not E is false. False and false is false. Therefore, the second premise is false. We are able to find a premise which is false, rendering our argument to be valid. What about if G and E are both false? What happens? G and E are both false. Therefore, this disjunction is false, but we want the negation. Therefore, this is true. True implies false is false by the rule of conditional. And therefore, we have a premise which is false. For the sake of discussion, we discuss the truth value of the second premise. G and E are both false, and therefore not G is true and not E is true. Therefore, the conjunction is true. However, as I mentioned earlier, we have found the first premise to be false, and because of that, the argument appears to be valid. What about if G is true and E is false? What happens to the truth values of the premises? If G is true and E is false, this is true. But we want the negation, so it is false. So false implies false. Remember, this is always false. We have assigned that earlier. So false implies false is true. What about the second premise? G is true. Therefore, not G is false. False and not E, whatever the value is false. Rule of conjunction. But for the sake of discussion, since E is false, not E is true. But we have false and true that is false. So again, we are able to find a premise which is false when G is true, E is false, and both M and T are false. That is the second premise. Again, argument appears to be valid. What about if G is false and E is true? G is false, E is true, therefore this is true, and we want the negation of that, so it becomes false. False implies false is true. What about the second premise? E is true, therefore not E is false. Therefore, this conjunction is false. So when G is false, E is true, M and T are both false, we are able to find the second premise to be false, making the argument appear to be valid. Now, what about if one of M or T is true? So, kung isa sa kanila true, ibig sabihin isa sa kanila ay false, no? Kung isa sa kanila ay false, itong consequent na conjunction na to, M and T, will also be false. So, ang mangyayari lang, kapareho lang nung discussion natin lahat kanina, where the consequent of the first premise is false. And we will have the same scenario. In all possibilities of truth values, we are able to find a false premise. And therefore, the argument is valid. Maiiba lang naman to kung parehong true yung M and T na hindi pwedeng mangyari, imposibleng mangyari yon kasi inassign natin na false yung conjunction. Okay? Ang conjunction magiging false kung isa sa kanila false o kung dalawa sila false. Hindi pwedeng mangyari na pareho silang true. So, hindi ito magiging true ever. Okay? Therefore, we have shown the existence of at least one false premise in all possible truth values, and therefore the argument is valid. Another example, we have F implies O and R implies E as the first premise, not F or R, and therefore O or E as the conclusion. Again, the first step is to assign a false truth value to our conclusion O or E. If O or E is false, what does it mean? Kung false ang disjunction, ang ibig sabihin lang nun, yung dalawang disjuncts ay false. Diba? Yung rule natin. Ibig sabihin, yung O at saka E ay parehong false. So, we need to assign truth values for F and R and determine the truth values of the premises from then on. Alright? Suppose F and R are both true. So, apat na possibility din yan, ano? Both true. Yung F and R, both false. Tapos, kunwari, yung isa sa kanila, true or false. Okay? So, suppose F and R are both true. So, true implies false. True implies false, no? Is false. R is true, E is false. So true implies false is also false. So false and false is false. So we are able to find a premise which is false. And because of that, the argument appears to be valid. Kahit hindi pa natin alam yung truth value ng second premise. But again, for the sake of discussion, let us determine F and R are true. Therefore, not F is false, but R is true. Therefore, this is true. But then again, we have found a premise which is false, no? When F and R are true and O and E are false. No? That is the second premise. That makes our argument appear to be valid. What if F and R are both false? F and R are both false. So, false implies false is true. False implies false is true. So, we have true and true. Therefore, the conjunction is true. So, F and R are false. So, F is false. Therefore, not F is true. True or false is true. Therefore, the second premise is also true. In this case, both premises are true, but the conclusion is false, and that cannot be. Therefore, the argument appears to be invalid. Because of that, we are able to find all premises true for particular values of the variable when O, E, F, and R are all false. So, yung dalawang premises true, pero yung conclusion false, and that cannot be. Therefore, the argument is invalid. Okay? I hope you are able to have a clear grasp of the proof of invalidity and will be enjoying the use of that method in proving validity or invalidity of arguments. So, stay safe, class. See you when I see you. Bye for now.